In April of 1943, a small team of American Navy cryptanalysts, working in a converted basement, decoded a Japanese naval message so detailed and so specific that it gave American commanders the exact date, time, and flight path of an inspection tour Admiral Yamamoto planned to make near Bougainville. Intelligence precise enough to let American fighters intercept and kill the man who had planned Pearl Harbor. The pilots who flew that mission became famous. Their names and the details of Operation Vengeance eventually well documented across decades of post-war histories. The codebreakers who actually made the mission possible in the first place received almost no public recognition at all. Their identities and their work kept classified for decades after the war ended, some of them dying without ever receiving formal acknowledgement for one of the most consequential single pieces of intelligence work of the entire Pacific War. This is the story of what happened to the codebreakers who predicted Yamamoto's death, and why it took the United States government decades to properly recognize what they had actually done. Here is the question worth carrying through this story. How does a team of people responsible for one of the most consequential intelligence achievements of the entire war end up waiting decades, and in some cases forever, for anyone outside a small circle of insiders to know their names? The specific nature of Rochefort's dispute with Washington reflected a broader institutional tension within American naval intelligence over how credit and operational control for code-breaking successes should be distributed between the forward-deployed Pacific stations doing the actual intercept work and the Washington-based office responsible for overall naval communications intelligence policy. A bureaucratic friction that, while it cost Rochefort his direct role in the day-to-day cryptanalytic work he had excelled at, did not disrupt the broader institutional capability and accumulated expertise that his team had built. Capability that continued functioning effectively under the reorganized command structure that followed his reassignment. It is worth situating this specific episode within the broader thread this channel has explored across earlier coverage of the Midway code-breaking effort and the Yamamoto shoot-down mission itself, since the human story of the codebreakers behind both operations connects directly to questions this channel has raised previously about how differently institutional recognition and public memory have treated the war's combat participants compared to the far less visible, but often equally consequential, intelligence professionals working behind the scenes to make those combat successes possible in the first place. By April of 1943, the code-breaking effort that had famously located the Japanese fleet before the Battle of Midway 10 months earlier had already undergone significant internal changes, most notably the reassignment of Commander Joseph Rochefort, whose Station Hypo team had produced the Midway intelligence, away from direct cryptanalytic work following a bureaucratic dispute with Washington's own Naval Intelligence Command over jurisdiction and credit for the Midway success. This internal Navy conflict, more about institutional territory than about any failure in Rochefort's own work, meant that the specific team responsible for decoding Yamamoto's itinerary the following year operated under a somewhat different organizational structure than the one that had achieved fame, however limited at the time, for the Midway intelligence breakthrough. The code-breaking unit responsible for the Yamamoto intercept, by this point operating under the designation Fleet Radio Unit Pacific, continued the same painstaking, incremental work of partial decryption that had characterized the entire code-breaking effort throughout the war, piecing together fragments of Japanese naval communications traffic into increasingly complete and actionable intelligence. A process built on accumulated pattern recognition and institutional knowledge developed over years of continuous work against the same evolving Japanese naval code systems. The codebreakers working under Fleet Radio Unit Pacific by this stage of the war had developed considerable accumulated expertise, specifically in reading the patterns and conventions of senior Japanese naval officers' travel and administrative communications. A specialized institutional knowledge, built up over many months of continuous work against the same evolving code systems. Expertise that proved directly relevant to correctly interpreting and verifying the specific details contained in the Yamamoto itinerary message once it was initially intercepted and partially decoded. The specific intercept that revealed Yamamoto's travel plans arrived through the same kind of routine, ongoing signals monitoring that produced the vast majority of American naval intelligence throughout the Pacific War. A message detailing Yamamoto's planned inspection tour of forward air bases in the Solomon Islands, including the precise dates, times, and specific aircraft he intended to travel aboard. A level of operational detail that Japanese communications security protocols, even after months of periodic code revisions intended to protect against exactly this kind of compromise, had failed to adequately obscure. Layton's own background made him particularly well-positioned to recognize the significance of this specific intercept. Since he had studied in Japan before the war and possessed a level of direct familiarity with Japanese naval culture and communication conventions that gave him genuine insight into both the technical content of the decoded message and the broader significance of what removing an officer of Yamamoto's specific stature and reputation would mean for Japanese naval morale and strategic planning going forward. Commander Edwin Layton, serving as Admiral Chester Nimitz's chief intelligence officer and one of the key figures who had also played a central role in the earlier Midway intelligence effort, recognized immediately the extraordinary tactical opportunity this specific piece of decoded intelligence represented. Historians examining the surviving records of this deliberation process have identified it as one of the more carefully documented examples of the fundamental tension every successful code-breaking operation eventually faces. The more valuable and specific a piece of decoded intelligence becomes, the more using it risks revealing to the enemy exactly how their communications have been compromised. A calculation that grows more acute, the more precisely targeted and individually consequential the resulting action becomes. Exactly the dynamic at play in a decision to specifically target and kill one named, high-profile enemy commander, based on decoded travel plans. The decision to act on this intelligence, however, involved genuine and serious deliberation at levels well above the codebreakers themselves, since American commanders understood clearly that using such precise, individually targeted intelligence against a single high-value target carried real risk of revealing to Japan exactly how thoroughly their naval codes had been compromised, a risk that, if realized, could have cost the United States its entire ongoing code-breaking advantage for the remainder of the war. This decision-making process reached, according to several historical accounts, senior levels of the American government, reflecting just how carefully the potential strategic cost of exposing the code-breaking program had to be weighed against the tactical value of removing Japan's most respected and capable naval commander from the war. The narrow time frame involved in this specific intelligence operation compounded the pressure on the code-breaking team considerably, since Yamamoto's travel itinerary covered a specific date only days away from when the intercept was first decoded, meaning the codebreakers had almost no margin for error or extended verification before American commanders needed to make their final decision about whether and how to act on the intelligence. A compressed operational timeline that added genuine urgency to work that, under less time-critical circumstances, might have benefited from more extended cross-referencing against other available intelligence sources. Stop and consider the specific position this placed the codebreakers themselves in, because their work did not end once the decoded message reached Nimitz's staff. Cryptanalysts including Thomas Dyer and Joseph Finnegan, among the specific individuals credited in various historical accounts with critical work on refining and confirming the precise details of Yamamoto's itinerary, continued monitoring subsequent Japanese communications traffic for any indication of last-minute changes to the travel plan, since American commanders needed the most current and accurate possible intelligence before committing to a mission that offered only a narrow window of opportunity and no realistic chance of a second attempt if the intercept information proved outdated or inaccurate by the time American fighters actually launched. Joseph Finnegan specifically has been credited by several historians examining the surviving operational records with playing a particularly significant role in confirming and refining the precise details of the itinerary message during this compressed verification window. Work that required not only technical cryptanalytic skill, but the kind of contextual judgment necessary to distinguish reliable, actionable intelligence from the ordinary ambiguity and partial information that characterized even successfully decoded Japanese naval communications throughout this period of the war. This continued, high-pressure verification work occurred entirely behind the scenes, invisible to the American public, and, for security reasons, largely invisible even within the broader American military establishment, beyond the small, tightly compartmentalized circle of officers and analysts with direct need to know about the source and nature of the intelligence being used. The codebreakers' names would not appear in any public account of the Yamamoto mission for decades, their contribution deliberately obscured behind official cover stories crediting the interception to conventional reconnaissance and visual sighting reports, rather than the actual signals intelligence that had made the entire operation possible. Thomas Dyer, another cryptanalyst whose work spanned both the earlier Midway breakthrough and the subsequent Yamamoto intercept, represents a further example of the broader pattern this episode traces. A career built around consistently significant technical contributions to some of the war's most consequential intelligence successes. Conducted almost entirely outside public knowledge or recognition, both during and for many years after the conflict itself, work whose significance became fully appreciated by historians and the broader public only once relevant government records were gradually declassified in the decades that followed. The deliberate American effort to disguise the true source of the intelligence behind Yamamoto's death, examined in this channel's earlier episode covering the P-38 mission itself, extended directly to how the codebreakers' own contribution was handled and concealed in the years that followed. American officials allowed and, in some documented instances, actively encouraged alternative explanations for how the interception had been arranged. Stories involving Coast Watcher visual sightings or routine reconnaissance patrols, rather than any acknowledgement of the sophisticated, sustained code-breaking effort actually responsible, a deception layered specifically to protect the broader intelligence advantage the codebreakers' work continued providing for the remainder of the war. The specific cover stories developed to obscure the Yamamoto mission's actual intelligence source had to be carefully maintained, not only in the immediate aftermath of the operation, but for years afterward, since any inconsistency or later revelation that contradicted the official reconnaissance-based explanation risked drawing renewed Japanese attention to exactly the code-breaking capability American commanders had worked so deliberately to protect. A sustained deception effort that required ongoing discipline and coordination among the relatively small circle of officials who actually understood the true source of the intelligence involved. For the codebreakers themselves, this meant accepting a form of professional anonymity that ran directly counter to how any other comparably consequential wartime achievement might normally have been recognized and celebrated, a sacrifice several of the analysts involved later described. Once their work was finally declassified decades afterward, as a difficult but fully understood and accepted cost of the specific kind of intelligence work they had chosen to pursue, work whose entire value depended on remaining invisible to friend and enemy alike. This pattern of enforced professional anonymity extended well beyond the immediate post-war period for many of the codebreakers involved, since several continued careers in signals intelligence work through the early Cold War period, an era when the specific techniques and successes of wartime cryptanalysis remained highly classified precisely because many of the same underlying principles and, in some cases, actual personnel continued applying comparable skills against new adversaries in the rapidly escalating intelligence competition that characterized the post-war decades. Rochefort's own reflections on his reassignment, in the limited post-war interviews he eventually gave once some of the relevant history had begun to be discussed more openly, reportedly reflected a characteristic professional restraint rather than open bitterness, a reluctance to publicly criticize the institutional decisions that had sidelined him even as colleagues, and, eventually, historians increasingly came to view the treatment of his wartime contribution as a genuine and serious historical injustice, deserving of correction. Joseph Rochefort, whose earlier work had made the Midway breakthrough possible, and whose broader code-breaking team's institutional legacy directly informed the unit responsible for the Yamamoto intercept the following year, experienced perhaps the starkest example of this pattern of unrecognized wartime contribution. Despite what naval historians studying the war's intelligence history have consistently identified as one of the single most consequential individual contributions of any officer in the entire Pacific War, Rochefort received no significant public recognition or decoration for his work during the conflict itself. His reassignment away from cryptanalytic duties following the Washington jurisdictional dispute, compounding the broader pattern of the code-breaking community's institutional invisibility throughout the war and for decades afterward. Despite what naval historians studying the war's intelligence history have consistently identified as one of the single most consequential individual contributions of any officer in the entire Pacific War, this recognition took decades to actually arrive, and it arrived only after his own death, a delay that several colleagues and historians who advocated for his eventual recognition specifically pointed to as illustrative of how poorly American military institutions of this era were structured to properly credit intelligence work compared to the more visible, immediately recognizable achievements of combat commanders and pilots, whose contributions could be publicly celebrated without the same security constraints. The full scope of the code-breaking program's wartime contribution, including the specific work behind the Yamamoto interception, remained substantially classified for decades following the war's end, with detailed public documentation only becoming available as relevant government records were gradually declassified beginning in the 1970s and continuing through subsequent decades. A delayed release that meant the codebreakers themselves, along with the broader American public, had to wait a generation or more for the full historical record of their wartime work to become publicly known and properly credited. Rochefort died in 1976, more than 3 decades after his Midway and Yamamoto-adjacent code-breaking work, without ever receiving the formal military recognition that colleagues, and, eventually, historians studying his contribution came to believe he had clearly earned. This declassification process itself unfolded gradually and unevenly across different categories of wartime intelligence records, with some material becoming available to historians and researchers considerably earlier than other, more sensitive categories of documentation, meaning the full public understanding of exactly how the Yamamoto intercept and the broader code-breaking program had actually functioned, emerged not through any single dramatic disclosure, but through a slow, incremental process of archival access that took multiple decades to substantially complete. It took a sustained advocacy effort by former colleagues and by naval historians who had gained access to the gradually declassifying wartime records, including Admiral Layton's own later memoir examining the code-breaking program's full wartime contribution in detail to finally secure Rochefort's posthumous recognition. Admiral Layton's own memoir, published in the mid-1980s, and drawing on decades of first-hand knowledge, combined with the newly available declassified records, played a particularly significant role in this advocacy effort, providing the kind of detailed, credible, and specifically documented account of Rochefort's actual contribution that helped overcome the institutional inertia and bureaucratic reluctance that had allowed his recognition to be delayed for so many decades after the war's end. A book whose publication timing coincided closely with the eventual awarding of Rochefort's posthumous decoration. In 1985, nearly a decade after his death, and more than 4 decades after the Midway and Yamamoto intelligence achievements his work had made possible, Rochefort was posthumously awarded the Distinguished Service Medal, a formal acknowledgement that arrived only after his own death, and only through the sustained, deliberate effort of others working to correct what they viewed as a serious and long overdue historical injustice. These individual recognitions, arriving piecemeal across different years and through different institutional processes, depending on each specific codebreaker's circumstances and the availability of documentation supporting their particular contribution, never fully replicated the kind of unified, immediate public celebration that combat participants in comparably significant Pacific War operations typically received. A persistent gap between the codebreakers' actual historical significance and their eventual public recognition that several historians studying this specific area of Pacific War history have continued to examine and, in various ways, work to address through ongoing research and public history efforts. Other members of the code-breaking teams responsible for both the Midway and Yamamoto intelligence successes received their own forms of belated recognition across these same decades, as declassification gradually allowed historians, and in some cases, the surviving codebreakers themselves, to finally discuss publicly work they had kept entirely confidential for the majority of their own lives. The broader legacy of this specific pattern, extraordinary wartime intelligence achievement followed by decades of enforced public silence, and, in many cases, genuinely inadequate formal recognition, has become a recurring subject of study among historians examining the specific institutional and psychological costs borne by signals intelligence professionals across the entire Second World War. A pattern this channel has touched upon in earlier episodes covering other code-breaking successes, but that the specific case of the Yamamoto intercept illustrates with particular clarity, since the mission's dramatic and publicly celebrated outcome, the death of Japan's most respected admiral, stood in such stark and lasting contrast to how quietly and for how long the actual intelligence work behind that outcome remained hidden from public knowledge and formal recognition alike. Remember the question this story opened with. How does a team responsible for one of the war's most consequential intelligence achievements end up waiting decades, and in some cases forever, for recognition? The honest answer, established through the specific documented sequence of Rochefort's own post-war treatment and the broader pattern affecting his colleagues, is that the same secrecy that made their work effective also made it institutionally invisible. And once the immediate wartime justification for that secrecy had passed, no comparably urgent institutional mechanism existed to ensure the recognition these men had earned actually followed once security concerns no longer required their silence, leaving that correction to depend instead on the slow, uncertain process of declassification and the personal advocacy of colleagues and historians willing to spend years making the case that these codebreakers deserved. If you want to understand how the people responsible for one of the most consequential single intelligence achievements of the entire Pacific War spent decades waiting, and in some cases never received, the recognition their work had clearly earned, this is the story worth knowing in full. Subscribe to Pacific War Tales for more long-form World War II history from the Pacific Theater, told with the names, the dates, and the details intact.